How do you destroy someone? Hopefully this is not a question we have to ask ourselves too often, but this is a question that the enemies of Jesus were asking themselves about Jesus. At this point in our study of the book of Matthew, we see that the crowds in Jerusalem love Jesus and appreciate his teachings. And so the Pharisees know that they cannot move openly against him or in an obvious way. They can't use the local police to arrest him and take him away, at least not in broad daylight. And so what they're going to try to do through debate and argumentation is to try to discredit him, to try to make him look bad, to try to get him in trouble with other people. And as we consider the kinds of questions that they ask him and the way that he responds, we'll learn some unique lessons along the way. So let's begin with the first question that Jesus is asked in Matthew chapter 22. So if you will turn with me to Matthew chapter 22. And let us read verses 15 through 22 together. Then the Pharisees went and plotted together how they might trap him in what he said. And they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, "We know that you are truthful and teach the way of God in truth, and defer to no one, for you are not partial to any. Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to give poll tax to Caesar or not?" But Jesus perceived their malice and said, "Why are you testing me, you hypocrites? Show me the coin used for the poll tax." And they brought him a denarius. And he said to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" They said to him, "Caesar's." Then he said to them, "Render to Caesar's the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And hearing this, they were amazed, and leaving him, they went away. Now, to appreciate the controversy behind this question, keep in mind, around 20 to 25 years before this question was asked, there was a poll tax, or I should say a census, instituted by the Roman government to record the number of the people in Palestine to figure out how much they should tax this region. Well, there was a man by the name of Judas of Galilee, a man I'm sure that Jesus heard about growing up, and he told his Jewish brethren that they should not submit to this census so that they could prevent the Romans from taxing them. And anyone who submitted to this census, his followers burnt down their houses and stole their cattle. Likely he and his followers thought they were following the spirit of the Maccabees, resisting an oppressive government, as their people had done 150 years earlier. And many in Jesus' day were sympathetic to their cause, or at the very least, sympathetic to their views on Roman taxation. And of course, we know that one of the apostles of Jesus was Simon, a zealot, different from Simon Peter, Simon the zealot. And likely Judas of Galilee was a man who he used to idolize. So I can't help but wonder how he felt hearing this very conversation. Now the Pharisees, as we've already noted, cannot act openly against Jesus because of his popularity. So they're going to try and ask him some controversial questions to make him look bad in the sight of the people. And if they're lucky, at least from their perspective, maybe get him into trouble, and very serious trouble. They send their own disciples to Jesus, perhaps to create distance between they and he. And they send his disciples to ask this question. They begin by saying, "Teacher, we know that you are truthful and teach the way of God in truth and defer to no one, and you are not partial to any." Now, of course, we know when we're reading the biblical text, we can't really read someone's tone, so we don't know if they're faking sincerity or the sarcasm is just dripping off every word. We don't know, but Jesus is able to sense, regardless, their maliciousness. And they ask this, "Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to give poll tax to Caesar or not?" Now, as we've already noted, there had already been a lot of civil unrest due to this very question. And so what the students of the Pharisees are trying to do to Jesus is create this dichotomy with hopefully, regardless of whatever answer Jesus gives, it gets him into trouble with someone. If he says you should pay the tax, they're hoping that these radical militants will make Jesus their enemy, maybe bring him harm, and at least hopefully alienate those in the crowd who who are against this tax. But if Jesus says, no, you don't have to pay the tax, they can go to the Roman authorities and say, hey, this guy is saying you don't have to pay taxes, therefore you have to arrest him. Now, Jesus, full of wisdom and knowledge, knows their heart, and he refuses to play their game. And he openly acknowledges their hypocrisy, but he still answers their question, maybe not for their sake, but maybe at least for those who are standing by. He begins by requesting a coin that was used to pay this tax. This would be a Roman denarius. And he asks a simple question. Whose inscription is on it? Whose face is on this coin? This is the equivalent of asking, well, is your name on it? Well, this doesn't necessarily have a Caesar's name, but it has his face, which is good enough. And they conclude, well, of course, this coin belongs to Caesar. Jesus then says, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And there are many layers to this statement, and we cannot help but think about how guilty these men actually look, since they are the ones using Roman coins, and yet they're trying to get Jesus in trouble about a question on Roman money. It appears that these men are benefiting from the Roman government and its wealth, and are using the very money that they don't want to have to pay in taxes. But if they're using Caesar's money, doesn't it make sense that Caesar should have some say in what he is owed? Another thing that Jesus is dealing with in the question they're asking is what is called a false dichotomy. It is a fallacy based on the premise that erroneously limits what options are available. And people do this in every walk of life. They do this in politics, they do this in religion, and let's just consider one example of a false dichotomy. Growing up, I would sometimes hear people say, you either go to college and get a degree, or you're going to be poor. That's a false dichotomy because they're acting like there's only two options when there's plenty of options. You can go get a job. You can go start your own business. You can learn a trade. There are more than just two options, but very often in religious context, this is what people do. They act like there's only one option or the other. Now, Jesus did not see it this way. He did not see the dilemma in having to choose between serving Caesar and God. Jesus understood that a Christian's only loyalty was not to God, but his greatest loyalty was to God. In Christianity, there are a hierarchy of loyalties, with God being at the top. But as we see very clearly in the New Testament, God still expects us to show loyalty to our friends, our family, our neighbors, and of course, even local officials. For Jesus, it was God first. And with God being first, there's no dilemma or conflict with paying respect to Caesar, or at least giving him what he is entitled to, especially if it's his money. And this teaching would be especially important for his disciples, as within the coming decades, they will have to struggle between their relationship with God and the relationship with the state. And this very teaching will help them prioritize God over their relationship with the state, even though they realize they have to respect the state in the process. After Jesus delivers this answer, convicting them in the process, since they're the ones using Roman money, we see that Jesus wins this first debate. But let's look at the second question that is asked this very day. Let's read Matthew chapter 22, and let's read verses 23 through 28. On that day, some Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to Jesus and questioned him, asking, "Teacher, Moses said, if a man dies having no children, his brother as next of kin shall marry his wife and raise up children for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers with us, and the first married and died, and having no children left his wife to his brother. So also the second and the third down to the 7th. Last of all, the woman died. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife of the 7 will she be? For they all had married her." Now, here we come across the Sadducees, and we actually know very little about the Sadducees. They were one of the groups within Judaism. They were a very small group. It seems that they were tasked with running the temple, or at least had control of the temple services. And they had some peculiar views. One of their peculiar views was in reference to the Hebrew canon. It appears that they only accepted the first 5 books of Moses as their Bible, while Jesus and the Pharisees accepted all of the Hebrew scriptures. In our Bible, it would be from Matthew all the way to the book of Malachi. So one, they have this unusual view about which biblical text that they preference. And this perhaps led to another unusual view that they had. Josephus tells us that they believe that when a person dies, the soul dies with them. This perhaps explains why Matthew reminds us that they do not believe in the resurrection of the dead, when every other Jewish group did. Of course, we know even Jesus himself believed in the resurrection of the dead. And when you look at the Old Testament in its entirety, it's very easy to come to that conclusion. Consider Daniel chapter 12, verses 2 through 3. Daniel writes, "Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground, that is, those who are dead, will awake, these to everlasting life, but others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. Those who have insight will shine brightly like the brightness of the expanse of heaven, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever." So for the Pharisees and for Jesus, of course, Jesus is the Son of God, but for any Jew who studied his Old Testament and appreciated all the scriptures, it was very easy to come to the conclusion, well, certainly there would be a resurrection of the dead one day. However, the Sadducees, because they only appreciated a few of the Old Testament books, they concluded that the idea of a resurrection was preposterous, because when we look at the first 5 books of Moses, the resurrection isn't explicitly stated. And they came up with what they thought was a pretty good conundrum to indicate the ridiculousness of the resurrection. And they devised this question that I'm sure they had thrown at many Pharisees in their day. And who knows, maybe even many of the Pharisees failed to answer their question. So they decide to pose it to Jesus. And they begin by citing Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 5, where Moses incorporates the Levirate marriage into the law. In ancient societies, when a woman would lose her husband, let's say her husband died and her husband did not provide her children, she would end up marrying his brother. And the brother would take care of her, provide an heir for her and her dead husband, and it was considered a very noble thing. Well, after this, they pose a scenario where they say, well, let's say hypothetically there was this woman and she marries this guy, and he happened to have 6 other brothers. But he dies before he gives her children. So according to the law of Moses, she needs to marry his brother. But let's say hypothetically that brother dies, and she has to marry the 3rd brother, and so forth, until where she has eventually married 7 different men because they all die, and then eventually she dies as well. By the way, I would really hate it for that woman, but they say, okay, well, if the resurrection is true, when she is resurrected, who is she going to be married to? Is she going to be married to all of them or just one? Now, keep in mind, this is not something they're pulling out of thin air. There was a Jewish story, probably a fictional story, that they had all grown up with. And we can actually find it in the apocryphal book, the Book of Tobit. In the Book of Tobit, there is a story about a young man by the name of Tobias. And he has an angel who follows him and helps him wherever he goes. In the book, he falls in love with a young woman by the name of Sarah. She seems to be a nice girl. The problem is she's been married 7 times before. And every time she gets married, a demon kills one of her husbands. So the question is, I really want to marry this girl, but how do we get past this demon problem? And of course, the angel helps him out, and it turns out to be a happy ending. And so part of the reason I bring this up is to illustrate that this is a scenario they probably all thought of to some degree. And from the Sadducees' perspective, they think, well, if the resurrection is going to result in these inverted, perverse, polygamous relationships, certainly the resurrection could not be true. And so they pose this question to see what Jesus will say. Now let's consider Jesus' response in Matthew chapter 22. Let's begin by reading verses 29 through 33. But Jesus answered and said to them, "You are mistaken, not understanding the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but they are like angels in heaven. But regarding the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was spoken to you by God? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but the living." When the crowds heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. Now, one of the first things that Jesus seems to respond to is their lack of, or their ignorance of the Scriptures. And this is very important. When someone asks us a difficult question, we want to make sure they understand what they're asking. For example, we might tell a person that according to the Scriptures, baptism is necessary for salvation. But some people hear that and they think, well, we think there's something special about the water in the baptistry. Or they say, well, you must believe that a person must work their way to heaven because you have to do something to submit to God. But we acknowledge what the Bible teaches, that when a person submits to God in baptism, it is God who works sanctification and justification, and therefore the glory and the credit goes to him. But very often, we might present a particular doctrine or idea, and then people might initially misunderstand. So we have to clarify. And this is what he's doing here, because it appears that the way the Sadducees understand the resurrection is simply a reanimation without anything changing. But Jesus clarifies a point that they've overlooked, that when they consider the rest of the Scriptures, when a person is resurrected, they actually become like an angel. They don't become an angel, but they become like an angel. Now, is this something that Jesus is revealing for the first time, or is this something that they could have naturally concluded themselves if they had paid closer attention to the Scriptures? Well, I think the Old Testament Scriptures actually bear this out, and this is why he says that they are ignorant of the Scriptures. Remember that passage we read in Daniel chapter 12, verses 2 through 3. Daniel says that in the resurrection of the dead, for the righteous, they shall become bright like the stars of heaven. And for those who knew their Hebrew Bible, knew that angels are often referred to as the stars of heaven or the host of heaven. In fact, we sang a song earlier. I think it was, I don't remember the name of the song, but there was one lyric where it said that we join in singing with the morning stars, which is a reference to the angels in heaven. And so Jesus concluded that if they had just studied the Scriptures a little bit more closely, they would have concluded, well, in the resurrection, it's not that just we become reanimated, but we're actually glorified. We're actually made like the angels in heaven. And with this, he concludes that their question about the Levirate marriage doesn't matter, because angels are not given in marriage. Now, how does Jesus come to that conclusion? When we look at the Old Testament, there's not an explicit statement that says angels are not given in marriage. How are the Sadducees going to let him walk away with making that statement? Well, we know in the Second Temple period in Judaism, or the intertestamental period, many of the Jews were able to look at the Hebrew Scriptures and conclude that angels should not get married. That would be a great sin if they did. And we see this very clearly in the book of Enoch. In the book of Enoch, chapter 15, verses 6 through 7, we see this fictional story where God is addressing these angels who had supposedly married these angels. And he says to them, "But you were from the beginning made spiritual, possessing a life which is eternal, not subject to death forever. Therefore I made not wives for you, because being spiritual, your dwelling is in heaven." So Jesus is able to already accept the conclusion that they've made about angels, which happens to be true, that angels are not made to get married. So Jesus is able to, so Jesus first claims that the Scriptures claim, according to Daniel 12, that when a person or a righteous person is resurrected from the dead, they become like angels. Second, angels are not given in marriage. 3, therefore, since saints will be like angels, there will not be a need for a marriage, and we won't even have this issue that they have created in this scenario. But then Jesus takes his response to another level. He addresses the heart of their issue, and that is that they don't really understand the power of God. He goes to Exodus chapter 3, verse 6, and this is important because he's appealing specifically to the scriptures that they hold to be canon. And he quotes God's introduction to Moses, where God says, "I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Now, Jesus is actually arguing from something as simple as the tense of God's statement. You see, if the Sadducees were correct about what happened to the soul when the body died, the text should have read, "I was the God of Abraham. I was the God of Isaac. I was the God of Jacob." But that's not what it says. God said, "I am," implying that I presently am the God of Abraham, because even though Abraham is dead, he still is. He still lives in some sense. And as we see in verse 34, they are silenced, and the crowds are astonished by Jesus' response. Let's consider one more question that is asked in this passage, and this question is from Jesus himself. Let's jump down to verses 41 through 46. Matthew 22, 41 through 46. Now, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them a question. "What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he?" They said to him, "The son of David." He said to them, "Then how does David in the Spirit call him Lord? The Lord said to my Lord, 'Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies beneath your feet.' If David then calls him Lord, how is he his son?" No one was able to answer him a word, nor did anyone dare from that day on to ask him another question. Jesus now tries to turn the tables on them by asking them a difficult question. He begins by asking, who is the Messiah? Whose son is he? And they answer the most obvious answer possible. He is the son of David. And when we look at the prophets, they always talked about the son of David coming and becoming the Messiah. And as we noted previously in Matthew chapter 21, this is what many of the Jews had already concluded about Jesus. As he was entering into Jerusalem, they said, "Hosanna to the Son of David." And so this is something many are already concluding about Jesus. But Jesus is about to take things to another level, because he is about to cause those who actually believe that he is the Messiah to have to wrestle with the fact that even though he's the Messiah, let me phrase it this way. Yes, he is the Messiah, but their understanding of the Messiah is limited and must be expanded. He begins by quoting Psalm 110, verse 1, where David, writing in the Spirit, being inspired by the Spirit, he writes, "Yahweh said to my Lord, my Master, 'Sit at my right hand until I put your enemies beneath your feet.'" So we have David writing about someone who is going to come after him. And he considers this person his Lord, his master, and someone whom God is going to sit at his right hand, implying authority over everything that God possesses. So the question that Jesus asks is, how can David's descendant be greater than he? Typically, it's the descendant who are inferior to the ancestors, but yet David humbles himself before this one who is coming after them. And he simply asks them, how can you make sense of this? And they can't. They don't know how to even understand it. Now, of course, we have the New Testament, so we can cheat a little bit. We know the answer. The reason that Jesus is greater than David is because he is not just the son of David, but the Son of God. And Jesus is actually asking a question that, if they are able to find the answer, it actually leads to one of the foundational truths of the gospel. In Romans chapter 1, verse 2, Paul summarizes the gospel, and he says that it is the message that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of David according to the flesh, and the Son of God according to the Spirit. And those who are sincere, those who are seeking, those who are going to give it more careful thought, will eventually come to the truth of the gospel. Now, we can't assume. Maybe some of the Pharisees were sincere. We do know from the book of Acts that some of them actually do convert, but even if they are not open to the truth, certainly someone who is there would be. Now, in the process of considering this passage and many of the debates that Jesus has with those whom he disagrees with, we've been able to look at some very interesting and important things, such as questions about balancing our loyalty to God and the state, questions about the future resurrection that everyone will experience, questions about the nature of this Messiah. But one of the other important things about this passage is it shows the importance of debate and argumentation. And when I say arguing, I don't mean screaming and yelling at someone you don't like. I'm using it in the logical sense to where when you disagree with someone, ideally what you do is you take your evidence, you take your reasoning, and then you try to change their mind. And this is exactly what Jesus was doing with his opponents. Now, some people feel uncomfortable by this. Some people like to try to avoid conflict, even to the point of avoiding a polite disagreement with someone else. But this is the only way we learn and grow. And this is sometimes the only way in which others will hear the gospel. At least for me, I learn the most when someone asks me a difficult question that I don't know the answer to. And I know, at least in my experience, people are more open to the truth when you ask them a hard question. Have you considered this? Have you considered that? Or you believe this? Have you considered this passage? This, and in fact, this is the tactic that even Jesus himself used with the Pharisees. And we have to remember that when we're talking to people whom we disagree with, it's not just important to keep in mind who we're disagreeing with, but who's listening. We may come across people whom we may consider to be swine. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I mean that in the sense of Matthew chapter 7, verse 6, where Jesus describes someone who is a swine as someone who is not able to assess what is holy or appreciate what is holy. We may come across people in our life who may not really care about the gospel, may not really care about what the Bible actually teaches. But we may enter into a conversation with them, not for their sake, but for everyone else who is listening. For example, in reference to social media and Facebook, and I try, at least for myself, to minimize the disagreements that I enter into on Facebook. But sometimes I'll see someone, one of my friends, maybe someone I care about, presenting a teaching or a doctrine that is actually inconsistent with the Scriptures. And sometimes what I do is I simply just comment, well, have you considered this passage or that passage? Because even if they don't change their mind, someone who is seeking the truth can at least go to that passage and think for themselves and conclude, or at least find the truth. Although when we are disagreeing with people and having these kinds of discussions, there's one important thing that we need to remember, and that is we are not Jesus. Jesus was the Logos. He was the embodiment of God's wisdom, and he knew all things, and he could communicate things in a way that anyone could understand. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, I don't know everything, and I don't always communicate in a way that is easy to understand. I try to, but I often fail. And so what we have to be willing to do as people who are not Jesus is say, well, you know what? I don't know the answer to that question, or actually, I don't know how to respond to that, or, you know what, let me study this just a little bit more and come back. Or we may even have to say, sometimes I'm wrong. You know what, I think, or say something to the effect of, you know what, I think I am inconsistent in my thinking here. Let me think about this a little bit further and come back to you. But nevertheless, even though we are not Jesus, we should strive to, as we see in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, we should always strive to have an answer for those who ask, so that we can be ready and willing to explain the reason why we believe what we believe. So hopefully we will be like Jesus and be willing to receive hard questions and to ask hard questions as well. Now, before we conclude, let's consider one aspect of this passage. Jesus tells us that one day there will be a resurrection from the dead. And according to Daniel chapter 12, verses 2 through 3, we see that everyone will be resurrected from the dead. Those who are unrighteous to everlasting contempt, and those who are righteous to eternal glory, to shine like the stars of heaven. And for us today, in the context in which we live, how we are resurrected is determined as to whether or not we pledge our loyalty to Christ and to become a part of his body. And if that's something you'd be willing to do now, of course, assuming you believe that he is the Son of David, the Son of God, assuming you're willing to repent of your sins and push those things out of your life that separate you from God, assuming that you are willing to put him on in baptism, we'd be glad to assist you now. And of course, with the understanding that you are committing to Christ to live faithfully unto death. But if you're here tonight, or this morning, and you're not a Christian, you are a Christian, but you have not been living in a way that is faithful to God, we'd love to pray for you. We know God will forgive you. He will give you the strength and the wisdom to do better, and allow us as your brethren to encourage you in any way. If there's anything we can do for you spiritually, please come forward as we stand and sing.